2015 global action to address climate change. Additionally, GHG is expected to meet this by reducing carbon intensity by 65% from 2005 levels by 2030 per unit of GDP. However, China's CO2 emissions increased by 80% between 2005 and 2018 and are expected to continue to increase to the next decade, given its projected economic growth. Further, 126 of the climate pledges are partially dependent on international technology and capacity building for the implementation. Many may not be implemented because little international support has been materialized. At least 130 nations, including 4 of the top 5 world's largest emitters, are falling far short of emissions reductions required by 2030 to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. From the National Geographic website, Kieran Mulvaney, 2019. Global carbon emissions increased by 1.7% in 2017 and a further 2.7% in 2018. The last 4 years have been the hottest on record. This card of evidence from the FPYC explains the majority of countries' pledges are insufficient. It also explains that the world's biggest polluter, China, has met its goals to limit GHG emissions to 60 to 65% per unit of GDP, but has seen a major increase in GHG emissions because their GDP is growing. This is an example of one loophole the accord has. Additionally, evidence provided from the National Geographic explains that greenhouse gas emissions actually increased by 2.7% in 2018 instead of decreasing. Overall, the goals of the Paris Climate Accord to keep global warming lower than 1.5% above pre-industrial levels is nowhere near being met. This proves that the Paris Climate Accord is currently ineffective at reducing carbon emissions because of different conditions and loopholes, which stunts any potential benefits the accord could have, meaning it is necessary to enforce the accord more accountable and close loopholes. Reason 2, enforcing the accord more strongly will reduce harms from climate change. From the Union of Concerned Scientists website, ULCS 2019. When carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, it prevents heat from escaping. This buildup of CO2 leads to one of the most obvious impacts of climate change, a hotter world. As the world warms, ice sheets and glaciers melt and ocean water expands. This produces sea level rise, which can disrupt and damage coastal communities and infrastructure in every seaboard country in the world. We could experience up to 8 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. Entire island nations face the possibility of going underwater. Climate change is also linked with heavier and more frequent rainfall, leading to destructive inland flooding. It is also making extreme weather more severe and in some cases more common. Megastorms like Hurricane Harvey have gone from occurring once every 100 years to once every 16 years. In drier areas, global warming is linked with longer, more extreme, and more frequent droughts and a longer fire season. The direct impacts of climate change also worsen existing inequalities. For example, hotter temperatures and droughts will make corn, wheat, and other stable crop supplies less stable, leading to price spikes and food shortages. There are roughly 800 million people currently living in extreme poverty, who would be most affected. Even only a small amount of warming will kill 70 to 90% of the world's coral reefs. Up to half of plant and animal species in the world most naturally rich areas could face extinction. The severity of climate impacts is directly linked to the amount of carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases that are released into the atmosphere. The more carbon, the worse the impacts will be. Avoiding the worst impacts of climate change will require limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This part of evidence proves that carbon emissions are the biggest contributor to climate change. It also explains that to stop the worst impacts of climate change, we must limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. The Paris Accord's goals are to limit carbon emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But as explained in Reason 1, the Accord is currently not meeting its goals because of the lack of enforcement and effectiveness. If we were to enforce the Accord more and reach its goals, this article proves that we would avoid many horrible impacts of climate change, such as sea levels rising, extreme weather, droughts, plants and animals going extinct, and more. These impacts will harm millions of people, especially the most impoverished, which can cause more inequalities. It is a necessity to enforce the Accord more and reach its goals to avoid the detrimental effects of climate change. Reason 3, enforcing the Accord will cause major cost benefits. From the Forbes website, Dominic W. 2020. The cost of renewable energy has tumbled to the point where almost every source of green energy can now compete with oil, coal, and gas-fired power plants. The most attractive renewable energy sources are onshore wind and solar PV. Onshore wind costs 3 cents to 4 cents per kilowatt per hour are now possible. Also, solar PV projects in countries such as Chile, Mexico, Peru, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have seen the cost of electricity as low as 3 cents per kilowatt per hour. The ability of renewable energy to compete effectively against old fossil fuel technologies is a result of consistent falls in the cost of new plants. Trends are likely to continue over the next decade, particularly for solar and wind power technologies. Over 75% of onshore wind and 80% of the solar PV capacity due to be commissioned next year will produce power at lower prices than even the cheapest coal, oil, or natural gas options. This card of evidence from Forbes describes that the cost for renewable energy sources are majorly declining, especially for solar and wind power, which both have gone down to as low as 3 cents per kilowatt per hour. It also explains that very soon wind and solar power will be cheaper than even the cheapest non-renewable energy sources. If the Paris Climate Accord enforce their rules in a more effective way, countries would have to switch from non-renewable energy sources to renewable energy sources. Because the cost of renewable energy sources are declining, switching to renewable energy sources will provide a cost benefit for countries and help their economies. Additionally, enforcing the Accord will prevent major economic crises and many costs caused by problems having to do with climate change, which were explained in Reason 2, such as extreme weather that causes damages to infrastructure or a high increase in food prices because of extinct species and crops. Overall, the Paris Climate Accord should be more strongly enforced because it is currently not being enforced enough, which prevents it from helping stop climate change, which has numerous extremely harmful effects and could cause millions to billions of deaths and possibly even extinction. It also has overall cost benefits from switching to green energy and not having to pay for disasters caused by climate change. I'm now ready for cross-examination.
Okay, so I'll keep this short.
Can I start?
I'd like to present a new definition for enforcement, or a different definition. The Oxford Dictionary defines enforcement as the act of compelling compliance with a rule, law, or obligation. And I think that is more true to the definition and tone of enforcement in this message. And I just have one question. Do you have any evidence or any examples of enforcement working in environmental protection situations internationally?
I don't have a specific card of evidence explaining other things that have been enforced previously. No.
Okay, well, that's all the time I'd like to use for my cross-examination speech.
Thank you. Are you ready for your first speech?
I am.
All right. I'm starting a timer. 3, 2, 1, now.
No, thank you. So I'm arguing against the resolution that the Paris Accords should be more strongly enforced. And this is not because I don't believe in the Paris Accords. It's because in this case, enforcement doesn't work. When it comes to climate action, incentives work better than enforcement. And that's the way the Paris Accords were actually designed in order to get 195 countries to join. Lack of enforcement is by design, as many nations don't respond to enforcement in order to protect their sovereignty. And smaller nations are hurt by financial penalties disproportionately, which can lead them to not be able to meet their expected climate goals. If they're penalized for not meeting them, it's kind of a vicious cycle. In this case, the problem with enforcement is lots of nations won't participate, and even if they do, it's hard to implement the penalties of enforcement. Who will enforce them? Enforcement doesn't work to achieve the Paris Accords goals because financial penalties are unfair to poorer countries, whereas they're not really any threat to rich countries. Enforcement would need court and appeals processes, which would take lots of time and resources to implement, and you would need everybody on board to actually meet the goals of the Paris Accords. This is global warming. It's an existential issue for humanity. And in order to solve this, we can't have everybody but China. It needs to be everybody on board. And many countries say they wouldn't join the Paris Accords if there are enforcements, including Russia, the United States, Canada, India, Japan, and those are just a couple of the big examples. But many, many nations, dozens, say they wouldn't join the Paris Accords if there are enforcements. So enforcements for the Paris Accords would lead us exactly nowhere. Penalties exacted on nations who don't meet goals would just make it harder for those nations to meet the goals, even if they do join the Paris Accords. And this kind of message of an iron fist to enforce climate change goals creates the opposite effect that the Paris Accords wants, which is unity. And this would create conflict. So my first point is that enforcement doesn't really work at all in this situation. Not that enforcement doesn't work, but in this situation and the Paris Accords, enforcement is not the right way to go because, my second point, incentives work more efficiently in diplomatic situations between sovereign nations. It's hard to enforce one nation's laws onto another country. You have a lot of lawsuits that take lots of time, like with countries suing certain companies and all this, but they're always domestic between one country. They're never international because those kinds of things don't work because, as I said, there's not a court and appeals process, which would take years and lots of money to make. So there's really no method of enforcement, which is why incentives work better because tax breaks are shown to work on corporations and countries in order to get them to do what they want. $100 billion fund, there's an $100 billion fund for poor countries, developing countries that the Paris Accords has made that's been funded by more first world nations. And this money in the fund is going out to smaller countries when they meet their goals. And that's shown to really motivate smaller countries. Another reason that incentives work is because of competitive dynamics. Nations' international reputations are on the line. And surprisingly, this does get very competitive. Political leaders are very conscious of how the world sees them. And another point is that incentives are working. Many countries have increased their target goals to meet those incentives and get those incentives offered by the Paris Accords. And that's just because incentives are a stronger way to go about this than enforcement. Enforcement would only tear away the Paris Accords and give them no power. No countries would join. The countries that did join would just be destroyed by these enforcements. It wouldn't actually get humanity to where they need to go to solve the issue of climate change, the domestic threat. and incentives are proven to work and are working, and because the Paris Accords have been on track to their goals in the most part. That's a
Do you see the rest of your time?
yes.
And you have 3 minutes for your cross-examination. Let me know when you're starting.
Okay, I will start that now. To start off, so are you saying that the incentives that the Paris Climate Accord have right now are working?
Yeah, so I kind of saw this question coming. The Paris Accords are not on track to meet their goals. And that is not because the incentives aren't working. It's actually because the United States has withdrawn from the Paris Accords. And the United States is a huge polluter, and it's brought down lots of the Paris Accords goals. It's kind of been tearing away at the structure of the Paris Accords.
Okay, so you're saying they're only not achieving their goals because of the USA?
I'm saying that the United States is a big part of that because of the current political institution instituting a lot of rollbacks on regulations for the environment in America, which is a big polluter.
Okay, what do you say about the new leadership that is currently going to be taken over by the US and Biden has said that he is going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord?
Looking forward to it. Not sure what the
well, like you were saying that they're only not on track to meet their goals because of the US. As the US joins back, they will still, it's not just because of the USA is what I'm saying. Can I
well, we haven't joined back yet. So
can I issue a point of conflicting evidence?
Sorry, I didn't hear
that. Can I issue a POI of conflicting evidence?
Yes, you can.
So my Rob Watson 2019 card from FPYC basically explains that it's not just simply the US. 128 of the 184 climate pledges have been deemed insufficient, which is 70%, including China, which is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And this is because they're going to meet their pledge of reducing carbon emissions by 60 to 65% per unit of GDP, but their carbon emissions are still have increased by 80% between 2005 and 2018 because their GDP is growing. So this is basically an example of one loophole. So the Paris Climate Accord currently, as it is now, because of China and other loopholes like this, would still not be able to solve this climate problem, as this point of evidence basically explains. And so we would need to decrease the loopholes in the agreements so we could get to that point. So that is a point of conflicting evidence. Also, do you have any specific evidence saying that these Russia, China, India, and Japan won't join? Like, what's your source for that?
Yes, let me just find it. Forbes.com, the article, expect climate catastrophe, Paris Agreement lacks enforcement, and also the article by Slate called The Paris Agreement is the Shove the World Needs, and it mentions several countries that won't join. All those nations are on that list.
What year was that in?
This was in the year 2015 and 2016.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, that's the end of your cross-exam. All right. So next we have, wait, hold on a second. Sorry, Hailey, we have your second speech. I got lost for a second.
Okay. Do we get like 90 seconds to prepare?
Yeah, you can request that. Would you like 90 seconds?
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
No. Okay, so first of all, you should prefer my definition over my opponent's definition, because I think the definition of carrying out the accord more effectively better describes the round and better describes the definition of enforcement. So what we are looking at is whether we should carry out the accord more effectively, and this fits more with the resolution, and this definition fits more. Moving on to some of my opponent's arguments, my opponent stated that lots of nations won't participate if it's enforced more, such as Russia, China, India, Japan. And first of all, the United States, this study was done in 2015 and does not consider the new leadership of the United States. And with our new leadership, which is who leans more left and is very passionate about climate change, will most likely still contribute in this Paris Climate Agreement. And it's not necessarily penalizing countries for not meeting their goals, but it's more carrying it out more effectively, such as closing the loopholes that my Robert Watson 2019 card basically explained. Like China, their carbon emissions are still growing because their GDP is growing. So kind of making goals that more align with making goals that kind of close these loopholes. So maybe setting goals such as decreasing overall emissions instead of emissions per unit of GDP, which would further help these climate change problems. My opponent also stated that it is just because of the USA, and that is simply not true. From National Geographic, Kieran basically described that carbon emissions increased 1.7% in 2017 and a further 2.7% in 2018. And these increases in carbon emissions wouldn't simply happen just because USA was not in the Paris Climate Agreement. And also, I'm almost positive the US was in the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017 or 2018. My opponent could respond on that later, but I'm pretty sure the US was in the Paris Climate Agreement during this time. And China, the large emitter, does account for much of the carbon emissions, not just the US. And many of these countries, to carry out it more effectively, to close these loopholes and conditions and more hold countries accountable instead of simply penalizing them. Also, my opponent stated that smaller nations will be hurt and penalized. And enforcing the accord more doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to penalize these smaller nations. We would also be offering support, international support. International support hasn't been materialized currently, and 130 nations, including 4 of the top 5 world emitters, are falling short of these goals because international support has not been materialized. So getting more international support, enforcing this accord more effectively enforcing this accord would help. It would help get to our climate change goals. And the harms of climate change are astronomical and could lead to extinction or deaths of billions of people, and also cause extreme inequalities because of poverty and because of an example of that would be an increased price of crops. And simply just keeping the accord as it is now is not going to solve this. Because simply the USA joining back in the accord is not going to solve these problems, as the carbon emissions have been continually increasing. Therefore, we need to enforce this accord more because of all of these climate change problems, because billions of people could die, and I outweigh my opponent on the magnitude of these problems because of that. And I would, the Paris Climate Accord is one thing that could solve for these problems and will also be cost effective for these countries. That's
Sorry.
my time.
My timer cut out. That's my fault. All right. Nick, your rebuttal speech. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting it now for 4 minutes.
So my opponent has said that countries would have to switch their energy production because of enforcement. This is not true. The same countries that I said before would just leave. That hasn't changed. The pro case has also said that the U.S. leaving has also questioned me, saying that the U.S. leaving has caused issues because. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The opponent has said, my opponent has said that because we have a new administration, somehow the rollbacks that have already happened aren't damaging, which I don't really understand that argument. When the U.S. joins back, it will be because there's no enforcement, not because of not because of what my opponent said, which is that more enforcement. Carrying out the accords more effectively, the definition of enforcement that my opponent presented is a pretty bad definition. That's not what enforcement means. Enforcement, according to Oxford Dictionary, is the act of compelling compliance with a rule or obligation. It's compelling compliance. So it's enforcement. The word force is right in there. It's compelling compliance. Carrying out the accords, that has nothing to do with enforcement, which is how you carry out the accords. Also, making goals to close loopholes. I agree with that. It's not really part of the resolution. An increase in carbon emissions is not because of the United States not being in the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords not meeting their goal is different. So what I'm saying here is that there has been an increase in carbon emissions. That doesn't mean that the United States is solely responsible for this, because there's a difference in increasing carbon emissions and the Paris Accords meeting their goal. So the Paris Accords goal for the next 50 years, I believe, is to halve the amount of carbon emissions. So just because carbon emissions are going up, that doesn't mean that the Paris Accords isn't working. Also, yes, the United States was in the Paris Accords the last couple of years. It was still rolling back environmental regulations in the United States. Also, my opponent made a big point about how we need to offer more support to developing nations. This is actually counter to her own point, which we need more enforcement. It actually serves my point, which is that incentives work very strongly to incentivize nations to meet their goals. So I don't know if my opposition realized that, but she argued for my point for a minute or two there. And also, yes, the last point, climate change is important. That's why we need more incentives and we need the Paris Accords to work. If we just use enforcement, lots of nations will leave and we're never going to get anywhere. I'm not saying keep everything the same. I'm saying that we need more incentives and not more enforcement of the Paris Accords.
Would you like to cede your time?
Yes.
So first of all, I will still be sticking to my definition because Merriam-Webster does define enforce as to carry out effectively, and I still believe that carrying out the accord more effectively is an achievable goal and is enforcing the accord more. Otherwise, carrying out the accord more effectively and closing these conditions and loopholes. My opponent also stated that decreasing loopholes is something that he believes we should achieve as well. And closing these loopholes is part of carrying out effectively, is part of enforcing the accord more. Closing these loopholes, so that is part of enforcing the accord more. Closing loopholes, closing these conditions that make the Paris Climate Accord less effective than it is supposed to be. Also, my opponent was a little bit confused on what I was saying about the USA. And basically what I was saying about the USA with their new leadership, they're still going to be joining, they would still join back in the Paris Climate Agreement, and they would, the new leadership would be happy about it being enforced more because we have a huge climate change problem, which my opponent agrees with. And this is my first key voter issue. We have a huge climate change problem, and these incentives simply are not enough. 128 of the climate pledges that countries have proposed, which is 70%, have been deemed ineffective. International support has not been materialized. My National Geographic card explains that carbon emissions increased by 2.7% in 2018. We have a huge growing climate change problem that could cause so many problems, as my reason to explained all of the negative effects, which could end up leading to war, famine, and even extinction. This is a huge climate change problem, and these incentives are simply not going to solve this problem. The incentives that we have currently and simply adding a couple more incentives are not going to help this problem. We need to enforce the Paris Climate Accord more, and we need to persuade countries to put in more extreme climate pledges to stop our huge problems with climate change. Also, the cost benefits are there as well. The cost benefits will improve people's economies. from switching to green energy sources. And my opponents say that countries will not switch to green energy sources. But if the accord was enforced more and more effectively to meet these climate pledges, these countries would most likely be switching to green energy sources, which will provide huge cost benefits. And it will also avoid huge extreme impacts that can cause cost harms, which will also provide cost benefits. Therefore, I urge you to vote affirmative and enforce the Paris Climate Accord.
Thank you.
I'm done prepping. Can I see the rest of my prep time?
Yes, you may.
Okay, thank you. So just to finish this up, I'm not going to bring in any new information. I'm just going to highlight the points that I've made. Enforcement would be great if it worked. Enforcing the Paris Accords is obviously the first thing you think of when you think of how can we make the Paris Accords work. You enforce them, you enforce these laws, and it sounds great, but it doesn't work. Most of the countries in the Paris Accords have said, and they haven't changed their position on this, that they would leave if enforcements join the Paris Accords. This is a big deal, and this is not something that my opponent has debunked. This is true. If we have nations leaving the Paris Accords, then we lose. We basically lose to climate change at that point. As I said before, they would not switch energy if enforcements were made. They would just leave the Paris Accords. They've said this in press conferences again and again, and these big nations have not changed their positions on this. My opponent also said that even with the United States, emissions in the Paris Accords went up. This is true. But as I said before, the US has also been rolling back environmental regulations in the United States, which they will soon stop doing. Also, emissions going up does not mean that the Paris Accords is not working currently. The Paris Accords want to stop the emissions rate from going up steeply to going up less steeply. And they're kind of cutting emissions over the next several decades instead of stopping them, which is a much more difficult goal to reach. So we have actually been on track for the Paris Accords in that sense. And I would just like to go over my two main points, which is that enforcement doesn't work. Financial penalties are unfair to poor countries. Enforcement would need court and appeals processes, which are very hard to set up internationally. They're almost impossible to set up internationally. And you would need everybody on board to combat this huge issue of climate change. And many of these nations will leave. Penalties exacted on nations who don't meet goals would just make it harder for them to meet the goals in the future. And incentives work more efficiently in diplomatic situations between sovereign nations. Tax breaks are shown to work. The $100 billion fund for poor countries that meet targets has been working. They've been achieving their goals. Nations are very passionate about their reputations, and these incentives are working. Many countries have increased their targets. What I want the takeaway to be, and this is why I urge you to vote con, is that incentives will work for the Paris Accords and enforcements will not. Many major nations will leave the Paris Accords. It will cause big problems. Enforcements will not actually get anything done, as they will just punish poorer countries. And incentives is the correct path to move through. And my opponent even said that we need support for these smaller nations, which is, to my point, incentives will be the biggest push towards meeting our climate goals and surviving with the Paris Accords. I urge you to vote con. Thank you. I'll see you the rest of my time.